Hello, and welcome to another guide for Divinity at Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Saba, who are the closest that you're going to get to playing as a merchant in Rome 2. They are by far one of the greatest economic factions possible, from rebuffs and debuffs to just the resources that they spawn with in their home province, possessing spices, silver, and slaves, all in their first province. Truly, you can build up an incredible economy with this faction, but the negative point for Saba is that their military is amongst one of the weakest in Divinity et Impera. They possess a variety of tools, but none of them are exceptionally strong. They have a couple of units that can compete against the world around them. However, they do feel kind of like a time capsule tucked away in the south of Arabia, where they had far too small of a population sharing far too great resources to ever develop militarily, and subsequently their roster just doesn't stack up against the great powers in Asia at the time. The Seleucids, the Parthians, the Ptolemies, they'd all give you a good kicking unless you plan your expansion thoroughly. And while it's quite easy to kind of get your feet off the ground in this campaign, it's very hard to expand into the mid game. You're going to have to be very strategic about it. So let's go look at the campaign map, figure out how to dominate the early game, and of course talk about this mid-game expansion, because I think that's the most challenging part of playing as Saba. Hello everybody. So when it comes to the start position of Saba, it's quite easy to get your feet off the ground. Your home province is tucked away here on the southernmost extremity of the map, and as such it's just a super duper duper safe province. Like, it composes of this settlement, this one over here, Eudaimon, and Mascat. And ultimately, if you control these three settlements, they kind of line up here on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, and nobody can really attack you here. Like, they'd either need to take boats from like India over here, which it's honestly a bit of a stretch. I don't think anybody is really realistically going to do that. Or the Ethiopians would need to take boats from like over here and sail downwards along the southern tip of Arabian Peninsula and attack Eudaimon. That's really not going to happen. Or over above you, there's the province of Arabia Magna, and in theory, these Arabian factions can head south and attack you. But these roads, like, they are incredibly long. It'll take them like 6 or 7 turns to traverse the deserts between your settlements and theirs. And in that time, you'd easily see it from a distance. You could raise an entire army to repel them. It's just super easy to counter. So ultimately, this province is just super safe, and it's super rich. You know, your starting settlement, your main city right here, it has spices. Down here at Eudaimon, you have trained slaves, and over here in Mascot, you have lead, which allows you to make silver mines. So ultimately, these three settlements are, like, together, they will create one of the strongest early game economies possible. The only challenge is getting them together. And really, the only correct option when it comes to trying to get your first province off the ground, to try to conquer your first province, is going to be to attack Eudaimon. It's much closer than Mascot, and diplomatically, you already have a trade agreement with Mascot. So if you attack him right away, you're going to suffer diplomatic debuffs. You don't really want that. So it's going to make a lot of sense for you to attack Himyar here. And honestly, they won't really put up much of a fight. In my couple of campaign tests I always run before my guides, I was easily able to annihilate this faction. It's just not particularly hard. When it comes to your first army, you're going to already have these chariots here. These guys can basically help you win this battle pretty effortlessly. But outside of that, you don't have a lot of great troops here. These archers are pretty good for lower tier archers. You're probably going to want to create like 4 or 5 of them, I would say, in your first army. You probably want to just have a main line of these levy spears, because at least they're somewhat stable units compared to your axemen, who are all charge and no holding afterwards. You could probably get by with 4 or 5 of these guys. You do want a decent core of, semi-professional axe units, so you already have 1 to start with, so getting 3 more would be quite prudent. Outside of that, you can probably just train militia to kind of shore up the gaps, but this is not a particularly strong army. It just, at the very least, your Arab adversaries over here, they won't really train anything significantly better, so it just makes sense for you to get that. Otherwise, when it comes to early upgrades, you're going to want to upgrade this town hall, but I don't think it's really worth it to upgrade this big dam. Like, you do start out with this wonder. It's not a very good wonder. You know, it increases sanitation and a bit of wealth and stuff, but it's just not super impactful. It just, when you upgrade it, you have to lose 500 to maintenance costs. So I find that this is more useful to do a little bit later. But that's all you really have to do. Once you conquer Eudaimon, I would send a spy over to Mascot and just observe how many troops they have. Because I found that Mascot, they fortify the settlement extensively. Like, every single campaign I played, and I've tried 2 Saba, Mascot does end up with a humongous military. Like, 2 full stacks of this axe unit that you have, the best unit that you currently have in your roster. So there's really no way for you to overcome it, because the AI is just cheating with money. Like, you couldn't afford this army if you did it yourself, even with the 2 settlements that you're going to have soon enough once you conquer Eudaimon. So I would just wait. In my experience, Mascot usually declares war on this faction over here, Hagar, and they send their armies over, they get destroyed against the walls of Hagar. And while they're preoccupied, you can just send your full stack, which would have recovered from this battle, all the way to Mascot and just overwhelm their garrison. I got Mascot for free pretty much in my campaign. And that's how you take control of your first province. Now, mind you, this province is exceptionally depopulated. It's one of the lowest population provinces in the game when it comes to your start. And because of that, it's going to be very, very, very important for you to wait a little bit once you grab it. Once you conquer all of it, you're going to want to boost public order, make sure that it's stable. You know, over here, I developed one of those yellow civic buildings. Over here, I developed silver mine, and I developed like a farm and stuff, because also you're not going to have the most food in this province. It is deep Arabia. It's kind of what you'd expect from the climate here. So you do need to make sure your food supply is good. You know, I had fishing ports in both of these settlements. And ultimately, I kind of waited for my population to expand while evaluating my expansion options once I conquered these 2 settlements. Because the thing is that you really have 3 ways that you can go once you've conquered your initial province. Either 1, you can ferry your troops across to Ethiopia. 2, you can expand northwards and kind of start getting closer to like Judea and Seleucia over here. You know, getting close to kind of the great confrontation between Persians and Alexandrian factions that's unfolding in Syria and stuff, and get your own piece of the pie as the premier Arabian empire. Or you can create a navy here and then sail your troops across to India and fight the Indians over here. Now, of these 3 options, the one I like the least is actually expanding northwards, because I feel like having so much distance between you and the Arabs to the north here is such a gift. Like, you have the greatest resources in Arabia, and you can just stay protected by the natural geographic features here. Why would you possibly rid yourself of that? I don't see what the point is in expanding northwards towards honestly pretty crappy settlements, and exposing yourself to the great conflicts happening northwards here. I would actually just stay put here, have this be the center of your economy, and just not worry about it. My second least favorite option is expanding towards India, because I just think that the Indians have far better troops. And of course, they're quite close to the titanic struggle unfolding in Persia, which the Parthians will come on top of, as well as Seleucid rebellions and stuff, and Bactrian expansion. Like, this area is just super competitive, and Saba doesn't have very good troops. Like, I'll go over it more extensively when I do my roster review, but ultimately, Saba just doesn't have particularly good troops. So I don't think that you're going to come out on top here in this struggle. I think it'll be a lot more challenging. I'd much rather go to Ethiopia, which is a bit of a sleepy region. They already have 50% desert nomadic culture, which is your culture group. So ultimately, you're going to benefit from that and have early expand recruitment options that are far better here. And I just think that Ethiopians are just generally less militarily successful, less militarily gifted as the Indians and the factions here, as well as once you conquer the Ethiopians, you'll have a staging ground for an invasion of Egypt. And Egypt is like literally one of the best economic provinces in the game. Like, once you have this, you're already going to have a pretty strong economy once public order gets balanced. But over here, when it comes to like Egypt, if you have the two of these provinces combined, you'll have such an overpowered economy that you can just dominate the rest of the game. Like, that's all you really need, folks. So ultimately, I think that that's just the best plan. Like, that's the way I'd go, but ultimately you can evaluate your options. When it comes to the way that your military stacks up, conquering the other Arab factions would be easiest because you're fighting on pretty even ground and you should be better into AI in combat. The Ethiopians have significantly better infantry than you when it comes to your conflicts with them. So ultimately, even the Ethiopians might prove to be a pretty challenging conquest to have. The Ethiopians do tend to expand quite slowly, so you're fighting a lot of one-and-done factions that already have local rivalries that may have deprived them of troops. But ultimately, when it comes to your military, you're always going to be the underdog in any of these conflicts, other than expanding north against the Arabs. So that would kind of be the one reason to expand against the Arabs. I think that it would just be a lot easier fights to take compared to elsewhere. But personally, I feel like strategically, it's just better to go up against the Ethiopians here, and as long as you're able to beat them yourself, then you should be good, and you have a ton of money, so you should be able to just dominate in terms of numbers, and that should hopefully remedy your weaker troops. And that's really it when it comes to the strategy in your campaign. One thing I can say is that early public order will be a humongous challenge. You can just get your faction leader married and then use this function right here, organize games. It'll just immediately start buffing your public order a lot. So that's just kind of an easy way to get around public order penalties, which, you're going to have a lot in these province early game, I find. So that's just something I recommend doing. And yeah, outside of that, that's really all I have to say when it comes to the campaign map. Now let's go look at the buffs and debuffs that Saba has, and go look at the roster, of course. Now when it comes to the buffs and debuffs that the Arabs have, they are more economically motivated factions, and you see that here with the factional buffs that the Saba and Nabateans get. The Saba get plus 10% wealth from all commerce buildings. I mean, that's just generally great. Every time that you build a resource building, you're going to get plus 10% wealth, and plus 10% is pretty solid. So overall, you're going to want to just utilize all your resources. It's really easy to build a strong economy as a Saba, and this is one of the reasons why. And plus 50% spice and slave resource production is crazy, because you start with both in your home province. Spice is in your capital building, and slaves are in Udemon. So ultimately, this just instantly becomes useful for you as a Saba, and that's just great. Collectively, these two will make you a far more wealthy faction than almost any of the factions here that you'd start with, like with just your home province. You have an absurd income going into early game, even with a small population. Once your population actually increased, it gets even better. But that's not it when it comes to the Saba. There's other economic buffs that are exclusive to the Saba. Increased agricultural income, so not just commerce buildings, not just specific resources here, but also agricultural income is increased. And increased income in regions with a market. So if you build a market building, which you're going to do that in your capital, a market is a capital civic building, then you just have insane income. Like if you just utilize all of these buffs in one province, which agricultural income's inevitable, you're going to have agricultural buildings. And then, you just have a couple of resource buildings to get the commerce buff. And of course, you're going to have spice and slaves just in your initial province. You just end up being crazy rich. And you know what? The debuff isn't even that important. Because decreased diplomacy with other Arabian cultures, believe me, that just doesn't really matter. Because truthfully, Arab factions are some of the easiest to get diplomatic alliances with. The AI, the diplomatic AI of each culture has kind of different priorities. Like some will be more aggressive. Like a Germanic AI rarely makes alliances or treaties with factions unless they're much stronger than them or very distant. But Arab AI, diplomatic AI, is extremely passive and defensive. They want to make as many defensive alliances as possible. They want to trade with everyone just to ensure but they're not going to get randomly attacked. Truthfully, they are some of the easiest to make deals with. So just because your diplomacy is low doesn't mean you can't make deals. I have found that despite having neutral or red diplomacy, I am able to still make agreements with every single Arab faction. So this you can more or less ignore and just take in the full extent of the economic buffs you get. Now, admittedly, the lack of any militaristic buffs really does kind of demonstrate the character of this faction. It's one focused on money. The military of this faction is not good. But if you combine all of these, you can make so much money. Like, in my tests, when I conquered my first province, like, it's my home province, I had a horrible population, but I was still making, like, a ridiculous amount. Like, I had a full stack military of elite troops, and I still had, like, 3,000 something income a turn. So believe me, these have a profound impact on the way that you play your campaign, and it's truly exceptionally easy to make money as the Saba. But now let's go look at the downside, which is their military. Because their military is really, really bad. Like, deceptively bad. Now, Saba's military is rather poor. It's by far the greatest weakness of this faction. Now, admittedly, I think it's quite fair, because they truly are the most economically gifted faction I have reviewed so far. There's no faction that starts out with so many easily accessible resources that are defensible by geography. Like, truly, you can just, like, if you want to just play as a merchant, you can just conquer your first province and just sit by and then eventually launch an invasion of Ethiopia, like, 100 turns later, and just enjoy growing your first province and presiding over your kingdom. You can make diplomatic alliances that make the other Arab factions in the north just a buffer between you and expanding empires. Truly, you can just be a merchant. But the military is not good. The military is not good. In general, all of your troops that come from your lower classes, and by lower I mean anything but sub-noble, like tier 2 population, 3 population, 4 population, is pretty weak. Maybe your cavalry is stronger than average. You know, the kind of eastern disposition for strong cavalry is very pronounced when it comes to Saba, but your infantry is really poor outside of the stuff that comes from your first population class. The things that come from your second population class are oddly weak. It's as if your warrior culture in Saba is somewhat underdeveloped because there was just no need for fighting so much. You know, I kind of get the impression that the Arab kingdoms were somewhat less how do I put this? Like, we just experienced war less people, long distances, lots of wealth, lots of resources. There was far less need for it. So subsequently, it just like there isn't nearly as strong of a warrior culture ingrained in your second tier population. It's only really the nobles who have to struggle about maintaining their place on the hierarchy, maintaining their wealth. You know, you have to do that with violence in the ancient world, or else someone else will seize it. And these nobles kind of make up the bedrock of your military for the only thing that's really strong in the context of the greater world. Like, out of all of these units, it's only the guys that come from the noble class which can really compete with everything else on the map. And I think as we kind of look for the stats of these units, it'll become more and more apparent that that's the case. Now, when it comes to your generals, you have the option of 4 different generals. 2 of them are early game generals, and then 2 of them are late game generals. The Saba have 1 reform that they go over. It's the Furos reform, turn 64 for Saba, because it comes a little bit later than the Greeks, because they're imitating Greek Furos technology. And ultimately, the generals are pretty strong for Saba going into late game. The early game generals I'm not as much of a fan of, especially the infantry option. You have the Sabaean nobles. Now, the Sabaean nobles are bad. They're bad for a noble spear. Like, they're like a fake noble spear. The reason why I say that is because their fighting stats are lower than a Freyo spear. And Freyo spear is the definition of your standard, no frills, mid-tier spear unit. You can see these guys come with 7, 17, 18, 22. These Sabaean nobles, they come with 8, 16, so higher melee attack but lower melee defense. You guys have 18 charge bonus. The Sabaean nobles have 19 charge bonus. These guys have 22 weapon damage. The Sabaean nobles have 24. You see how it's such a marginal difference? And at the same time, the Sabaean nobles, they're a medium spear unit with 150 men. The Freyo spear, these guys come with 225. So ultimately, the Freyo spear comes with 75 more men. So I'm sure in like an actual fight, the Freyo Spear would probably beat these fake Sabaean nobles. And by fake, I just mean that they're not very good. The only good thing about this unit is that it has 30 armor, which, you know, at least in the context of this roster, you'll find it to be a pretty high number. But when you talk about the whole game, like, when you look at a noble unit, you expect like 35 armor on the lower end, 38 armor if it's like a good unit, and, you know, 41 armor if it's like an exceptional unit, like say the Galatian 4X swords. 30 armor is pretty bad for a noble unit. 44 base morale is horrible for a noble unit. That's like mid-tier territory. The Freyo Spear has 1 less morale. This is a mid-tier unit disguised as a noble. It comes from your first population class. Now, the thing about your spearmen is that they kind of take on the Eastern Spear archetype, which I haven't covered yet because we haven't done a ton of Eastern factions. But Eastern Spearmen, they replace a little bit of combat effectiveness with having a bow. And with the bow, they fire 5 shots. Now, if they get all of that ammunition off, it does end up being pretty deadly. Like, they can get like 20, 30 kills before we even get into combat. The problem, of course, is that bows take a while to fire, and if these guys are making up the main line of your unit, of your army, you kind of expect them to take the enemy charge. So if the enemy just charge you directly, these guys are probably not going to get all of your ammunition off at once. But if you find yourself in a tactical situation where you can actually use the ammunition, like say the spearmen on the flank, so they can kind of wrap around and start shooting the enemy in the flank. Or perhaps the enemy is kind of staying put, like we're taking up a defensive position, so you can actually expend your ammunition before going into combat. Or it's late game, your men actually manage to win their fight frontally against the enemy unit, and now they can kind of maneuver around and shoot their arrows. But it can be really useful. But I kind of find that, you know, compared to barbarian spears, which are just generally stronger, and Greek spears, which will come with volleys of javelins, I find that the arrows are a little bit harder to use. I feel like they're a bit of a higher skill buff. Like, they're not altogether useless or anything. It just, you know, at the end of the day, if the enemy charges you, and this is the main line of your army, you're not going to get the chance to shoot off all 5 ammunition. So you kind of have to put some thought into how you're actually going to get that ammunition off. But when you look at these stats, this is just such a poor noble unit. It's just an inferior noble unit. It like is the gatekeeper between noble and mid-tier. And I feel like some mid-tiers are better than this. I feel like I've definitely seen Iberian spearmen and stuff like that have come from the second population class, but are available in early game, like say the Editani. Like, I'm just comparing these guys to an actual good spear faction. You know, when we look at the Editani, let me find them. You know, they start out turn 1 with the ability to recruit Biscatari, and they have, like, better combat stats. Way better combat stats. 225 men. You know, I feel like these guys would win really easily compared to these guys that come from the tier 1 population, and this is totally a mid-tier unit. You know, when it comes to the Boii, they have an early game noble spear, and look at this, way better combat stats, way higher melee attack, melee defense, 225 men, same armor. This is better in every single way. This unit would crush these Sabaean nobles, no problem. So that's why I wouldn't take it. They're just such a mediocre unit. But come Furos Reforms, you get the Sabaean champion, and this is actually by far the best melee infantry that you have. This unit's actually really good. They copy the same archetype that actually the Shotel warriors use for the Ethiopians. For, what are they called? Sorry, I'm trying to find them. The Medawi. Where are the Medawi? Or are they where Kush is supposed to be? Because I don't see them with all the other M's. Sorry, I'm just trying to find where the Medawi. There they are. I mean, yeah, it's the same exact unit as the Shotel Warriors, except the Shotel Warriors have 3 speed. These guys have 2 speed. The Shotel Warriors have a volley of javelins. These guys have no ammunition to throw. But these guys have 35 armor compared to the 25 armor of the Shotel Swordsman. And the Shotel Swordsman only has 46 base morale, while these guys have 56. A full 10 morale more. So these guys are better once they actually get into combat than the Shotel Warriors. They're also heavy, heavy in nature. The Shotel Warriors, they are a medium unit. So overall, this unit's actually better in combat. The only challenge is that they come from your first population class, so you're going to have to expend nobles to train them. But they're truly a good unit. I've tested them out, and, you know, they're not better than the best swordsmen in the game, but they come close. They come close. They can beat an early game Roman Praetorian. They can beat this unit, the Scipio Praetorian Guard, in a face-to-face combat. This unit, because it has 32 weapon damage, which is absurd, it's higher than the best Celtic swordsman in the game. This is an amazing weapon damage and really high charge bonus. And because of that, they can beat the Scipii Praetorian. They're going to lose to the next Praetorians, they're going to lose to Marians, they're going to lose to the Imperial Praetorian Guard, but having a swordsman that can beat the lowest end elite Roman swordsman is still really good. That makes the Saba have a swordsman which is better than the vast majority in the game. Against the Galatians, they were able to beat the Galatian Chosen Swordsman, which is like a generic elite Celtic swordsman. They can beat a lower tier Celtic swordsman that they will lose against the Galatian Thorax, which is the strongest Celtic swordsman in the game. Meaning that this guy can do as well as a upper level Celtic swordsman. That's not bad. For an Eastern faction to have a swordsman that can do as well is like, you know, the higher end of Celtic swordsmen. That is a profoundly good Eastern swordsman. So this is actually worth bringing. It's an exceptionally strong sword unit. The only problem is, as I mentioned, they come from your first population class. If they're hard to maintain, they're hard to recruit, you know, you're not going to have too many armies during your campaign that are going to have a full line of these guys. It's kind of like the Spartans in the dynamic with this infantry, in a sense that your one truly competitive unit comes exclusively from your first population class, so you're always going to have to replenish them, focus on them. It makes having elite armies more difficult. But ultimately, if you can get a main line of these guys, get 8 of them in one army, then you're truly cooking with gas, and you're going to have an absolutely insane army for your Saba campaign. If you manage to get these guys going, it's just, again, like your population is so low that you're just going to have to cultivate it for many, many turns, for dozens and dozens of turns before you can start pumping these guys out in a sustainable way. Otherwise, you're just going to go through them entirely with one army. Now, moving on to your cavalry options, you have 2 different cavalry options. And the good thing about Saba's cavalry is that they all come with 90 men. You know, that's how the Medowi are, that's how the Messassili are, that's how the Parthians are. The Eastern factions have larger cavalry units, which kind of allows them to dominate the cavalry field of the game, which makes sense. The Eastern nobility were famous for being excellent cavalrymen, so it makes sense that they'd have a buff, especially when their infantry are basically consistently bad. So yeah, when it comes to the cavalry, you have 2 options, a late game version and an early game version. Your early game version is a very uninspired Alexandrian style shot cavalry. You know, they have kind of like noble shot cavalry stats, but the lower end ones, you know, they have 13 melee attack, 5 melee defense. That's akin, like when you're looking to the Macedonians, to like the Thessalian cavalry, but it's not going to be as good as the companion cavalry, and I'll show how that plays out. You can see over here, like the Thessalians are going to have stats that are similar to that. You can see here, you have 13, 15, 57, 28. Literally identical to these guys, 13, 5, 57, 28. The armor for these guys is just going to be okay. It's 33 armor. You know, a good cavalry unit will have 38 armor or 35 armor. So this is kind of the lower end of elite status. 50 morale is the lower end of elite morale. The only thing is that this unit's pretty quick. It has 6 speed here, but it's actually the higher end of 6. Like, this number isn't fully representative of the speed of a unit. Like, it actually, like, the bar can be more full sometimes and have the same number, if that makes sense. And this is like 6, but it's really close to 7. So this unit's a bit faster than average for a noble companion style cavalry. But that's really the only main thing. Like, statistically, these guys are a little bit underpowered, but they have 90 men. So ultimately, like, you kind of expect your unit to be a little bit weaker if it has 90 men. So that's a trade-off that you take with this unit. Your late game version is just going to be a really good melee cavalry. A really defensible one, though. This unit has 45 armor. It's a bit slower than your companion cavalry, though. It's going to have lesser charge bonus. It's going to have lesser weapon damage. It's going to have more melee defense, but lesser melee attack. Because late Sabaean Royal Cavalry is a lot more defensive, but it's really effective at being defensive, because 90 men with 45 armor is really good. This is a solid unit. It's a very, I'm going to say this for the billionth time, but a very, very, very defensive cavalry unit. And because of that, you know, considering that your melee, you know, contingent isn't exceptionally good at, you know, how do I put this, like, doing damage, you may struggle to do decisive things on the battlefield just because your late game cavalry will have a defensive character. But subsequently, like, your general, you know, your general is better protected by this unit than this unit by far, because these guys have more armor, they actually have a shield so they can block ammunition, that type of thing. So I feel like for your general's bodyguard, I'd prefer the late version over the early version. But when it comes to your actual cavalry, I'd much prefer to kind of get these regular Sabaean nobles compared to the late Sabaean nobles. But that's just me. Your general unit's also a little bit underpowered compared to what you normally get. It's weird. Like, your general unit has more armor, but less melee defense. So they're actually worse out in a grind out fight, which is a weird detail. I just wanted to make you pay attention to that. Like, this general unit is exclusive. Like, you can't recruit it in your normal shock cavalry contingent, and this unit actually has lesser combat stats than the one you can recruit normally, but more armor and more morale. So I guess that kind of makes sense. Like, you want your general to be more survivable, so not terrible. Overall, when it comes to your generals, I'd either take the cavalry or I'd take the champions. I'd never take the spear. Now, moving on to your melee infantry. You start out with these Red Sea Light Infantry. These guys are your militia axemen. They're a really weird unit. They're a really weird unit because they suck. You know, 1 armor and, you know, 5 melee attack and 6 melee defense makes us an awful unit. The only good thing is that they can do a lot of shock damage because they do have 24 shock bonus, charge bonus, which is pretty good. It's better than any sword unit in the game besides a 2-handed swordsman. So this has a really good charge bonus. These guys absolutely provide impact on the charge, and they have 3 javelin volleys, probably 4 with whatever buffs you get on your general. So ultimately, these guys can throw a lot of javelins and then rush in, making them an effective flank troop. You can definitely have 4 of these guys on the flanks in early game, maybe 2 of them in late game if you are trying to save money on an army, because ultimately these guys do suck at fighting. Like, if they get charged by virtually anything, they will lose and run from the battlefield. With 1 armor and horrible morale, they're not reliable in the slightest. But if they throw their javelins into the flank of something and then charge it, they'll actually kill it, even if it's a pretty elite unit. So high risk, high reward, very cheap, so easy to make cost effective. That's what this unit is. It's an easy unit to make cost effective, but they will let you down if you try to use them as a main line. In my first playthrough, I tried using these guys in the main line, and they ran so consistently that you just can't. You can't do them for that. But you can either use them on the flanks, or you can have them as a stretched out line behind your main line, let them throw their javelins, and then cycle charge them in and out, and let them use their armor penetrating damage. If you want to go slightly better, from your second population class, you can recruit these Arabian Axemen. And these units, they're not very good. This is a very poor unit for an elite axe unit, and the stats reflect that. Like, 7 melee attack and 9 melee defense is incredibly low end when it comes to an axe unit with 150 men. Like, if I just compare this to, like, say, Gallic axes, which aren't very good, you can see this Galatian axeman, it has 9 and 11. Dark Verni are going to have a better axe unit. Actually, the Gallic axeman, which is one of the weakest units, is similar to this one. So, just, this unit's not very good, but, like, the Gallic axeman will have 20 armor. These guys only have 15 armor. Like, overall, this is one of the weakest mid-tier axe units in the game. And, you know, this unit really isn't helped by only having 15 armor, 9 melee defense, and 38 morale. Not even 40 morale. Like, anything sub 40 is particularly low for a mid-tier. So this unit's also not very reliable. Truly, they're the best unit available for you when it comes to your turn 1 recruitment, but outside of that, they're pretty weak. And once you get the Furos reforms, you do get a significant upgrade here in your Sabaean Axemen. Like, literally, it's an upgrade in every single category. Morale, armor, melee defense, melee attack, charge bonus, weapon damage. It's all improved over your Arabian Axemen. So these guys will be permanently laid to rest once you get your Sabaean Axemen. But come your early armies, you can have a couple of these. You can recruit probably 4 of them, even 6 of them, just because you don't have anything better. And that's going to be down to your rather poor spear component, but we'll get into that later. Now, I only wanted to bring your attention to this unit because when it comes to your conquest of Ethiopia, the closest settlement to you is Aksum. So closest settlement from Eudaimon. It's probably going to be the settlement where you touch down. And this is an area of recruitment unit available in Axemen, and it's just crazy good. These stats are incredibly elite when it comes to an Axe unit. Like 11 melee attack, 11 melee defense. It's better than your Sabaean Axemen. It's as elite as an Axe unit gets. Like when it comes to Nabatea for late game infantry is almost the same. Meanwhile, its weapon damage, charge bonus, its armor penetration. These guys are as high as Axe units, like single-handed Axe units gets. This unit is super elite. The only thing it sucks at is that it has no ammunition and it has basically no armor. It only has 15 armor, which is super bad for like a high-end unit. But this unit is so offensively capable that it will be by far the best shock infantry that you can recruit. Logistically, it's nearby. You're probably going to expand it to Ethiopia. I recommend that you expand it to Ethiopia when it comes to your first province you conquer outside of your home field. So because of that, I kind of feel like this is an important thing for you to utilize. Like whatever army you recruit 4 of these guys into, they will have significant shock capabilities. So they're kind of a tool that's at your disposal reasonably, and considering how bad like these 2 units are, like this is just cost effective, but it's a terrible unit. You know, it's not a good unit. It's just, you can get good money out of them. And this unit is just not very good. They're incredibly mediocre. Terrible for a second tier unit. So considering that, like, this is actually a way better unit. Like, compared to this one, compared to your Arabian Axemen, this noble Axemen of Aksum, it's better in every single category, other than it has the same armor and it doesn't have a javelin volley. So I totally take this unit. But anyway, moving on. Come to Furos reforms to get the Sabaean Axemen. And this is the first acceptable Axe unit that you have, but it's not a great Axe unit that you have. Like, just to point out, like, we did the Medawi last. That was the last thing, the Ethiopians. It's the last unit I did a review, sorry, the last faction I did a review for, and they have a tier 1 Axe unit that's literally better in every single category compared to the Sabaean Axemen. But these guys come from your second population class, so at least they're reasonable to recruit. They have 20 armor, they have decent charge bonus, they do armor penetrating damage, so if you charge these guys into like the rear of a pikeman or something, they can be pretty good. It's just the problem is that Axe units are completely incapable of being a mainline in Rome 2, at least the single-handed ones, because ultimately these melee attack and defense stats really hold it back. Like these guys need to be charged in and out of combat consistently to do damage. And because of that, you really can't base an army around these guys. Like at most you have 2 of them or 4 of them in an army, depending upon what you want to do with them. If you have 2 of them, that means you're probably putting them on the flanks and they're kind of just cycling around the enemy and trying to overwhelm the flanks with just their shock damage. Or if you have 4 of them, you're probably putting either 2 on the flanks and 2 in the middle or 4 in the middle. And you have them stretched out as a secondary mainline. Because like say you have a weak spear mainline, right? The spears are going to like absorb the enemy charge, and these guys are going to go in and out in order to make the mainline engagement go your way. So that's kind of the tactics for which you can use them, if that makes any sense. But ultimately, like these guys can't ever be a super decisive mainline unit for you. So let's go try to find that mainline unit. Ideally, it'll be these guys, the Sabaean champions. These guys are just exceptionally good. Exceptionally good for the reasons I pointed out. Like amongst the Eastern factions, you aren't particularly blessed with a lot of amazing infantry. That's one of the reasons why I said the Medawi are as strong as they are, because they have 3 top tier infantry options between their Axemen and the Shotel warriors. But the Sabaeans, they only have 1 top tier melee option, and that's these swordsmen. But you know what? Swordsmen are by far the most versatile unit in the game. I mean, the Romans are the best faction, and the Romans use exclusively swordsmen to assert their dominance, basically. So having an elite swordsman that's capable of going up against kind of the better swordsmen in the game. Like, these guys are akin to an Arverni Oathsworn. They're akin to, you know, a Galatian Chosen Sword. They're akin to an early game Praetorian. Like I mentioned, these guys are a top tier sword unit because they have good armor and exceptionally strong melee stats. Because of that, you'd ideally have these guys in the main line, but because they come from your noble population, I don't believe that you're going to have more than one army that actually has a full-on main line of these guys. I believe that throughout your campaign, you're probably just going to have to deal with having maybe 2 or 3 of these in a good army. So what's your second tier unit that you can use as a main line? Well, it's going to have to come from your spear infantry, and there really aren't a lot of strong spears at your disposal. The first spear that you have are the Sabaean militia. This is a totally average militia in Divide et Impera. Totally average militia. 612, nothing special. 1 armor's terrible. This is actually a below average militia, if I really have to put it. So don't use these guys other than for your first army. They'll break your heart. Your Caravan Guard, this is a weird unit because it actually comes from a naval building. And it's not very good. You know, 7 melee attack compared with 16 melee defense is militia-esque. The only thing that sets this unit apart from a militia is that it does have 25 armor, which, you know, no militia has 25 armor, so it has mid-tier armor. It has 38 base morale, which is getting close to mid-tier levels, you know, and it has 5 ammunition. It has those archer rounds, arrow rounds, but I don't think this unit's particularly strong. You know, 150 men at 25 armor isn't great, and the actual offensive capabilities of this unit is quite poor. The only way you can really get your money out of this unit is if you actually use that ammunition, but like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to use it. A more offensively capable unit would be your Caravan Guard, or sorry, your Urban Guard. The last unit was the Caravan Guard. The Urban Guard here, this is a much more offensively capable unit. It has 10 melee attack and 10 melee defense, so this is a shock spear unit. 23 charge bonus and 21 weapon damage make these guys a bit better in a fight. I feel like an extra charge bonus does make a difference. But this unit is less defensively capable. It has 5 less armor. It has less morale. Dude, 36 morale is really bad for a mid-tier unit that comes from your warrior population. So while this one's lackluster offensively, this unit is lackluster defensively. It's far too flaky for a mid-tier unit. This unit has the, you know, actual, like, it literally has the armor of Threo spears. Like, it's not exceptionally well armored, but 46 morale is terrible. So these guys are way less reliable than Threo spears, despite coming from coming from a higher population, coming from the second population class. And these stats are nothing special. The Aravachi, they start out with a 225 person spearman turn 1. These medium spearmen, sorry, these units are actually way better. This unit is way better because it has 12 melee defense. And we start out with these guys turn 1 and they have more base morale. And 225 men. So, you know, considering that the Aravachi start out with a unit that comes from, I think, the 3rd population class or the 2nd population class, so the same or lower, and it has better stats and more men, you know, it shows that the Caravan Guard are once again nothing exceptional. And the Nabatean nobles, we already covered why this is a mediocre unit. So all 3 of these spear units are weaker than they should be, considering the tier they come from, considering the price that they cost. They're not stable. And that's why I'm saying the axe units of Saba are also, like, not very easy to use. Because, like, none of the spears that you have are capable of actually holding their ground properly. Like, they will be outcompeted by equivalents from other factions. And axemen, by their very design in Divide et Impera, are not particularly good as mainline units unless they have a double-handed axe, because then they just charge in and just murder. You just have to avoid getting them destroyed in a skirmish, so you just kind of charge in. But one-handed axes, they just lose against swordsmen in a prolonged combat. They lose against good spearmen in a prolonged combat. These guys are for going in and out of battle. They're not stable enough. But then the spearmen you have aren't stable either. The only good unit you have is this household infantry. But here's the kicker. They also come from your 1st population class, and they come from your upper tier barracks too. Actually, no, sorry. They come from your 2nd tier barracks. Sabaean swords come from your 3rd tier barrack. But seriously, like, this unit is good. It has 9 melee attack, 20 melee defense, 35 armor, 48 base morale. But it's not great. It's not great because they have the same stats as a 4-axe spear. Let me get out a generic 4x spear from Syracuse. There you go, generic 4x spearman. Same stats, but better armor. So these guys are weaker than a 4x spear, and a 4x spear is already a pretty generic late game unit. So I think household infantry has one more melee attack. Yeah, one more melee attack, but worse armor. So you know what? Equivalent to a 4x spear. Actually, no. I'm starting to realize there is a difference because these guys have more charge bonus, more weapon damage. They are better marginally than a 4x spear. So sorry, I apologize. These guys are better than a 4x spear, but they aren't significantly better. There are obviously barbarian units that are far more elite, have more melee capabilities, like the Bowiite unit I showed you before. But at the end of the day, like, these guys come from your first population class, so the real challenge is that they're going to clash with your Sabaean champions, who are, in my opinion, more of a priority for recruitment because you don't have any other swordsmen. Get swordsmen, you have other spearmen. Sure, these guys are much weaker than the household infantry, this is by far your best spearmen, but considering how scarce nobles are in Divinity at Impera, I really do feel like it's advantageous for you to just prioritize your Sabaean champions. And that's really the trade-off when it comes to these two. You can have some nice axemen to act as a second line. Ideally, you'd have a nice main line of Sabaean champions. Like, your best, like, your ideal army, considering, like, how likely you are to have the population, would be, like, 6 of these in, like, the best army that you have in the game. Cavalry General. You know, you have to go for lower tier populations for spears. So you go for, like, 4 of these spears. You have like 4 of these axemen, maybe 2 of these axemen, or like these guys ideally. If you invaded Ethiopia, you know, main line of archers, and then cavalry, you know, the best cavalry that you have. Or if you can't afford to get nobles, you maybe have 2 of these, and then 2 of these warrior horse archers. But that would kind of be your ideal army. Now moving on to your skirmishers, you have very average skirmishers as a Sabaeans. I feel like this faction would be stronger if they had an elite skirmisher that was actually worth it, but they don't. Now starting with your lowest tier, you have this Arabian light infantry. It comes from your third population class. It is a really shitty skirmish unit. It has terrible missile stats. Like, this is as low as a javelin can get when it comes to everything from range to missile damage to ammunition. Just bad. It only has 1 armor, so these guys are extremely flaky. They will get annihilated by enemy long-range skirmishers. The only good thing about them is that they go into combat with an axe, so they have a somewhat reasonable charge bonus and great armor penetration damage. It's just they also have bad melee attacks, so they won't really utilize an armor penetration too advantageously. But ultimately, you know, if you get these guys on the flank, they can do some damage. Lower tier skirmishers do tend to be cost effective. If you just get them within range and they throw their javelins, they usually pay for themselves. So just, this unit's pretty bad altogether. The Sabaean archer, this is a totally average archer. It's akin to Greek archers in terms of its abilities to actually shoot. I believe that these guys might have slightly better melee capabilities than the Greek archer, because I am looking at the, you know, 5 and 6 melee attack and defense. That's actually not terrible for a lower tier archer. You can see it's actually better than the Greek archer, but it's still not very good. So while these guys can handle themselves in a melee somewhat better, and they do have slightly better base morale, this isn't a great archer unit. It's not like a top tier archer unit. Something like a Kushite archer would be better. You guys can see here, a Kushite archer has 150 men, better range, better damage. You know, a Parthian archer, these guys would be better too. These guys have 150 men, same range. You know, the only really good thing about this Sabaean archer is that they have slightly better melee stats than your average archer. So that's kind of the way to understand these guys. On a flank charge, they can be slightly more effective, but ultimately, they aren't really an amazing archer by any means. Your Arabian slingers kind of followed in the same footsteps. They have slightly better melee stats than the average slinger, but it's not saying much. Slingers have the worst melee stats of every single skirmisher stereotype here. Like, generally, javelin men are the best, slingers are the worst, archers are in the middle when it comes to melee. These guys have slightly average, but completely normal, good slinger stats. At 11 missile damage in 190 range is completely normal. Basically all Celtic slingers have it. Basically all Eastern slingers have it. It's basically what you want. And these guys have a shield too, so they're definitely good. When it comes to your slinger, your missile component, you're going to get these Sabaean archers, or you're going to get these Sabaean slingers most likely. But ultimately they are pretty average when it comes to their skirmish ability. They're not above average, and you kind of wish that, you know, as a Sabaeans, as a roster that doesn't have the best infantry, but you had slightly better skirmish capabilities, I mean, sure, your spearmen can kind of back up your archers, and you can maybe just have a lot more ammunition to pour into the enemy than the average faction, but that's really the only way that you get a skirmish edge. When it comes to your elite skirmishers, you have the Sabaean irregular unit, and this really is a hybrid infantry unit. And I say that because these guys are an archer unit. They have elite archer stats, 175 range, which is good. It's elite. Honestly, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Like, I've seen elite Scythian units with similar missile capabilities as these guys. And then in melee combat, they have the melee stats of like a lower tier early game barbarian swordsman. That's what they have. 26 weapon damage, 11 melee attack, 9 melee defense. Like, they have kind of like the melee stats of like an Iberian swordman, like a low tier early game Iberian swordsman. Like, I think that they have pretty much the same. No, the Aravachi light infantry is different. Trying to think here. They might actually have the same stats as the Sikori one, now that I think about it. Skordiki. Look at that. Almost the same. 26 weapon damage, 18 charge bonus. Same thing here on the regular, I think. 18 charge bonus, 26 weapon damage. Same thing. Melee defense is 1 higher on this light swordsman. That's it. That's it. But the regular does only have 10 armor and 37 base morale. So this unit is pretty squishy. If they get charged by cavalry, they're done. Because for an archer ultimately and a swordsman. But these guys can't help beef up your main line. That's the thing. These guys, like, because they are a reasonable sword unit and you don't really have other sword unit, like, if you take a couple of these, like, they will help skirmish and then they will literally just integrate into your main line. If you pair them with a couple of champions, you can actually have a pretty good sword contingent for an Eastern faction. Like, honestly, a remarkably good one. So these guys are totally worth bringing, but they come from your second population class and they're very expensive. They're very expensive because having like your actual skirmish component be anything more than just like a lower tier one, that is really going to improve your chances of beating better factions as a Saba. So they're priced appropriately. They're very important for you to bring and they're very expensive. Now moving on to your cavalry as a Saba. You have a lot of options that aren't like god tier, but they're pretty dang good. That starts out with your camels. Now, all of your camels, they come from a separate building. They don't come from your regular cavalry barracks. So if you want your full, like, cavalry roster, like you want your chariots and you want your 2 low-tier camels, you're going to need to create, like, a third barrack in your province. So they might not be completely worth bringing. But the advantage is that your camels come from your third population class. So they come from your easily recruitable common class. And not a lot of factions actually get cavalry that come from that class. Also, your camels are pretty useful because they scare horses and they're pretty fast despite that. You can see both these camel units have a 7 movement speed. So they are useful as kind of a really cheap unit, but they're not very good objectively. Like, they will get defeated by a mid-tier or elite cavalry unit with ease. These camel attendants particularly, like, look at how bad these melee stats are. 7 melee attack, 7 melee defense is low end. 11 armor is really low. 33 base morale is hilarious. At least they have a couple of javelins, a couple of little darts that they throw. They have 3 of them. And they have a pretty good 40 charge bonus. This is great for low end cavalry and movement speed that's pretty good. Like, these guys, they're not going to take a cavalry charge from a good cavalry unit very well. But if they go into, like, a melee with, like, a light skirmish cavalry, they'll probably beat them just by scaring them away. Or if they hammer an anvil with one of your better cavalry, they can help defeat a better opponent because they're going to scare the horses. So like in terms of hammer and anviling against enemy infantry, chasing down light infantry, chasing down enemy light horsemen and dealing with them, or just in general, like hammer and anvil, because 40 charge is not horrendous, it's still serviceable. Like these guys are good. You just have to, it's like these militia axemen, like you have to use them for what they're worth. This is a really cheap cavalry unit that's going to do the job in certain situations, but not be a good staple horseman. The Sabaean cavalry aren't a good staple horseman either, though, because they only have 18 armor. They have 8 melee attack, 5 melee defense. Like, these guys are supposed to be your mid-tier cavalry, but they're so bad because of just how light they are. They're way too light. Like, sure, the mass is medium, and they have 7 speed, but they have the melee capabilities of a light cavalry. 37 charge bonus is one of the worst things I've ever seen. They do go into combat with axes, though. That's why they do 12 armor-penetrating damage, so don't really know where to put them. It's weird that cavalry fights with axes. There aren't a lot of cavalry in Divide and Impera that fights with axes, and that's what kind of makes these guys a little bit of a wild card. Plus they have 90 men, so they're already going to be a little bit statistically poorer, but my gut really tells me that there's no way that a unit with these types of melee stats can be really good. These guys will get defeated by a reasonably strong melee cavalry on the field. Like, if you even look at like the Medowi, like I think that their melee cavalry, their base melee cavalry is way better. Like, you can't compare that unit to this. 9, 13, 48, 26 versus 8, 5, 37, 18. Like, this cavalry unit is way too underpowered, but, you know, again, kind of like this unit, if you charge them into the rear, if it can kind of kill with an armor penetrating damage, but they basically do the same skirmishy role that the camel attendants do, but for way more money, and they come from your second population class. So the camels are better. It's just hard to have a camel building in your settlement because it's a third military building, and you might not want to focus so much on military. And, you know, getting your regular cavalry is kind of more important. Now, the thing is that once you get your Phareos reforms, this terrible unit goes away, and you actually get a reasonable cavalry unit. You get the unit that you looked at here, but you get with right away is the Medowi. You know, it's also 90 men. You know, just has better statistics. Like 47 charge is pretty good, 26 weapon damage is pretty good, 23 armor is not great, but it's acceptable on a 90-person unit. Because overall, as you look at this unit, this is like a good jack of all trades, solid unit, comes from your second population class, is very cheap. 1,300 over here, like that in the campaign is going to translate to a sub 200 cost unit. Like, this unit almost costs as much as your Sabaean archers. They cost less than your noble swordsmen. They cost the same amount as your noble spearmen. Like, for a cavalry unit, this is really cheap. It's actually going to be very versatile, great against skirmishers, can rear charge infantry pretty well. This is just a solid mid-tier cavalry. It's just cheap, but not amazing, not extravagant. It's not like the Parthians who are actually going to have game-breaking, amazing cavalry. This is just a good, cost-effective cavalry unit. And again, it's one of those cost-effective tools, but not an actual competitive tool that the Saba have compared to other factions. The Sabaean nobles, we already covered them at the beginning. It's an uninspired Alexandrian-style cavalry. It just, when it comes to the regular version, not the one recruitable as your general, which is exclusive, you know, this unit still comes from your first population class, but it's way worse. 11 and 4 is like mid-tier. Charge bonus at 54 is mid-tier. At least these guys come with 90 men, but they're not actually very powerful. It almost makes your camels more worth it to bring because your upper echelon of cavalry isn't very good. But at least once you get into your late campaign, once you get to the Phareos reforms, you actually get a competitive unit. And this is your best cavalry unit here. You know, it has elite fighting capabilities, elite melee capabilities. Like, this unit is akin to elite barbarian melee cavalry, whether it is the early Arverni melee cavalry. No, it's better than the early Arverni melee cavalry. Let's go look at the Gite. Look at this. It's as good as a late Royal Getic cavalry. Except it has less armor, but it has more men, right? It has the elite 90-man unit. So this is overall just an above-average cavalry unit. Just across the board. Totally worth bringing. Great unit. Your missile cavalry is a bit weirder because you start out with the Arabian camel archers. And I actually kind of like this unit. Because unlike in the main game, the vanilla Rome 2, camel archers in Divide and Impera can actually fire over their shoulders, so they can do Parthian shot. While this unit is actually very fast, it still has 7 speed, so unless it's being charged down by a unit with 8 speed, it's actually a pretty good unit. I'm sure they don't have the best archer stats. They only have 140 range, which is pretty bad. It's still an insanely cheap horse archer to bring. One of the cheapest in the game, comes from your third population class. And it scares horses too. So if you get them into a melee combat, they actually will do pretty well. Like, look at this. Look at these stats. They're a bit like Sleeper. Like 28 weapon damage is really high. 36 charge bonus is not bad for a skirmish unit. And 4 armor. It's just for the price. Like, this unit actually can be effective, but only for the price. Like, as a cost-effective thing. Objectively, it's not a good unit. But for the price, they're good, and they're very easily recruitable because they come from your commoner class. So you don't have to expend elites. Like, together, these two units can be very cost-effective and come completely from your third population class. So in a cost-effective based army, like in a cheap army, you're trying to min-max, these guys will totally work. But moving on to your cheap javelin cavalry, as I mentioned throughout the campaign, almost every faction gets a cheap javelin throwing skirmish cavalry. They're almost always useless. This is one of those useless ones. Don't bring them. Your camels are way better. Your melee cavalry is way better. This unit, the only thing is that it's the first cavalry unit that you can recruit with your level 1 cavalry barrack. So if you're desperate, bring them, but otherwise never bring them. They suck. But they come from your third population class, so at least you don't have to use warriors or nobles to get them. If you want to use your tier 2 population, you actually have a pretty good horse archer. This unit, very good mid-tier horse archer, because it has 90 men, so it shoots more ammunition than a 75-man horse archer. But you know what? They have pretty good statistics. 8 speed, maximum speed, 40 morale. That's a nice mid-tier morale. 13 armor, better than a lot of other horse archers. Horse archers don't tend to have good armor. But then they actually have pretty good combat stats. Like 30 weapon damage is crazy. 9 melee attack is pretty good. Like, this unit, it's good at skirmishing, it's good at combat, it's not exceptional at either, but it's very light and maneuverable. It's actually a solid kind of jack-of-all-trades horse archer, which is deceptively decent at a melee, while also providing good skirmish support. Like, if you bring like 2 of these and 2 of these, you're gonna have a good cavalry component. If you bring 4 camels, you're gonna have a really cheap and just hitting above its weight cavalry component. And you know, you fill out that army with some okayish archers, some, you know, kind of like cheap infantry this way. You know, you kind of maybe splurge in a couple of swords and, you know, this, and you know, maybe you get a couple of spears just to kind of fill it out. Like, you can make a deceptively sleeper cost-effective Sabaean army either. But overall, when you combine these tools together, Sabaeans don't really compete with other factions. Their chariot isn't amazing because it's not a scythe chariot. So these guys, they do tend to die very quickly. Like, this is kind of a weak chariot unit. It can still cause chaos. It can still be a decisive game-winning unit for you. But I'm just telling you that these chariots are really, really low on health. Like, if you look at a Seleucid chariot, that chariot had like 80 health, by the way. Like, a Seleucid scythe chariot, this unit has a health of 140. So the average chariot in this unit does not have very good health. And 45 base morale is not elite. It's just mid-tier. So overall, this chariot can run pretty quick. And that's it for the Sabaeans. When you just kind of bring these units together, their cavalry is nothing amazing. The Medawi have better cavalry options, in my opinion. But actually, sorry, I can't say that actually, because the Medawi, like, late-game cavalry is worse than the Sabaean late-game cavalry. The Medawi don't have good cavalry compared to Saba. I have to come clean with that, actually. I think I'm a little bit overhyped in the Medawi. But they have, actually, okay, the Royal Cavalry is worse than the late-game Sabaean cavalry, but they have cataphracts. The Sabaeans don't have cataphracts. Like, overall, the Sabaeans actually have pretty low-tier cavalry. Like, it's kind of hard for me to decide if the Medawi have better cavalry or the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans have more options, but I feel like every option the Medawi have is, like, perfect. While, you know, some of these options, like this cavalry is not very good. This cavalry is not very good. It's just kind of cheap. Like, overall, the Sabaeans have cost-effective cavalry, but they don't have good cavalry. They just have oddly cheap cavalry. And that's the things about the Sabaeans across the board. Like, they have a really good swordsman, but it's not the best swordsman in the game, and it's really hard to recruit. They don't have amazing skirmishers, they just have one that's kind of above average, and the rest of them are just regular skirmishers. Their spearmen generally kind of suck, they're kind of below average, they're hard to use, hard to make use of, but one-handed axemen, they have some decent options, but overall, it's a really hard unit to deploy, because overall, when you combine the Sabaean roster, you get a lot of tools that don't quite work together. You can make some really cost-effective armies, but if you go up against an elite Roman legion, an elite Parthian army, an elite Seleucid army, what are you going to bring here that's actually going to get you kills? It's really, really hard, and because of that, the Sabaean army is just generally underpowered. They're a mercantile civilization that hadn't developed the most competitive tools to make war with. They have good tools, but they're expensive tools. They're hard tools to get out, and you're almost condemned in this campaign to use a lot of mercenaries. You want to conquer areas with mercenaries so you can start throwing them into the field. And because of that, I really can't say the Sabaeans are a super powerful faction. I feel like in terms of military, just because they do have lots of cheap options, they have some cost-effective options, I'm going to make them an average faction. Like, I'm going to give them a 5 out of 10. But they're kind of a hard faction to use militarily. But in terms of actually how hard this campaign is, it's not a very hard campaign. Because once you get your first province, you can just sit and chill. You can buy your time, become incredibly wealthy, invade Ethiopia when you're ready, take advantage of whatever chaotic conflicts are happening there, and then invade Egypt. You have one of the easiest strategic positions in Rome 2, Divide et Impera. If you actually use them, you can exploit the map so much as the Sabaeans. It is ultimately, you're going to have to kind of get this somewhat crappy, outdated military to use. You know, you're going to have to make use of your camels. You're going to have to figure out how to use them on the field, even though they don't have much armor or killing capabilities. You're going to have to make use of these Eastern spearmen that are kind of reminiscent of the spearmen that Alexander the Great dumpstered when he invaded Persia. Like, it's an outdated army. It's kind of like the Medoui that are conveying the culture, the military culture of ancient Egypt. The Sabaeans are kind of conveying the old military culture of the Achaemenid dynasty, but with a more Sabaean flair, a more caravan-leading mercantile flair to it. And of course, the Arabic swordsmen that kind of convey the Arab culture of having elites at the top that, you know, are very cultured and kind of trained in a more almost artistic method of warfare. Like, these guys are duelists, basically. That's what they are, and have very heavy armor. Of course, the cavalry is not exactly elite, but they're numerous, and they're cheap. It's just, at the end of the day, they're a completely average faction militarily, but they're a somewhat hard faction to use, despite being average. They're average because of the tools they provide, but they're hard tools to use. Because of that, I'm giving you a 5 out of 10 when it comes to military might, but in terms of campaign difficulty, I would say that this is basically a 3 out of 10. It's below average when it comes to difficulty. Very easy to get rich. The only difficulty comes with beating elite factions. You're going to have to campaign very strategically, because if you get into massive scale battles with elite factions of great infantry, like say the Romans, you're going to struggle to kill them, and you're going to have to somehow get a lot of your nobles on the field. So because of that, I would say it's a 3 out of 10. You know, the difficulty comes from your military struggles, but ultimately your strategic and economic advantages make it an easier campaign than average for sure. In terms of how much you need to play this, I actually really liked this campaign. I actually really like it. It has a really cool charm to it. The nobles are such a unique sword unit, but they're kind of cool to use. The spearmen are oddly crap, so you kind of have to compensate with your cavalry and your axemen being weirdly defensive and like biding your time in early game, building up your province. There aren't very many campaigns that incentivize it, but this one does it so much, but it's just unique. This campaign is unlike any other in Divide et Impera. It's a true merchant playthrough. And I actually really like that. I like really nerding out about like my economy and stuff like that. So because of that, I'd actually say it's like an 8 out of 10. I'd say it's a very unique campaign. I'd say it's a very challenging campaign militarily, but not strategically, which is great. It makes it super chill. You know, your battles end up being more rewarding, but you don't have to struggle against like 10 really powerful factions at once, like you would with like, say, a Seleucid campaign or one of the more militarily dominant ones. So it's like, at the end of the day, if you want to have a chill campaign, but also like have to struggle to win battles, which is actually a really, really cool blend of challenge. The Saba are for you. So in terms of how much you'd want to play this, I highly recommend 8 out of 10. But that's it when it comes to this campaign. I honestly, like, how bad this roster is kind of makes up part of the charm. And that's why it's kind of cool. So, I don't know, that's my take on Saba. Leave a comment if you agree or disagree, and like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this guide. And I'll see you in the next video, as we are going to be covering the Sabaeans, an Arabic faction which is much better at conducting itself militarily, but doesn't quite have the liberty of being so passive and easygoing in the early game. Bye for now.